Just imagine what happens if one of those drones gets through and hits a US or a UK ship. We're going to war with Yemen.
Yeah.
We've been to war with Iraq, we've been to war with Libya, we've been to war with Syria. It didn't go terribly well. Left those countries in ruins and didn't achieve much for us. So are we really going to do that again? Well, we've just taken the first step.
Predicting something that hasn't quite happened, but they know it's about to happen. So the Times airstrikes on Houthis after strife in Red Sea, and the Telegraph UK and US prepare strikes on Houthi rebel bases, and the Guardian poised to launch. What do you think?
Well, it's a very big development, and the US had made a red line about this. If the attacks on the ships continued, they would respond. So to show strength, they have to do it, but it's taking us down a very treacherous path. These are the prime example of asymmetric war. A drone costs virtually nothing. The missiles to shoot them down cost $4 million. There are a limited number of those anti-drone missiles on each ship, and they can't be resupplied at sea. So really, to keep the ships protected, they had to do this. But just imagine what happens if one of those drones gets through and hits a US or a UK ship. We're going to war with Yemen.
Yeah.
We've been to war with Iraq, we've been to war with Libya, we've been to war with Syria. It didn't go terribly well. Left those countries in ruins and didn't achieve much for us. So are we really going to do that again? Well, we've just taken the first step.
And you say we go to war with Yemen, but the question is who in Yemen, because there is a dispute over who is the legitimate government. Now, the internationally recognised one is the one that was supported by Britain and particularly Saudi Arabia, which was supplied it with arms. But the Houthis have been in charge of a significant percentage of the country for quite some time now and supported by Iran. So the question is, what do the US and UK strike, and what about civilians?
Well, they'll try and strike the munitions dumps and the ports that these drones are coming from, and the ships. They've got armed ships now, remote control ships, little boats coming in, trying to attack the international shipping. So that's what the targeting will be. People saying Parliament needs to be warned. I heard one of your speakers on earlier saying, there must be the element of surprise. Well, the Iranians are perfectly capable of reading the morning papers. There's no sense of surprise because the government obviously wants to announce it's doing something. So they will move all their stuff. Obviously, they'll be doing that right now, and it is very likely these attacks won't be particularly effective. The asymmetric war is on. And we just have to wonder how long it is before they get a big hit,
Yeah, and what the implications of that might be. Poppy, the Times tells us that the US-led response would be limited but significant, and it gives us a description of the kinds of British aircraft that might be involved. Your paper also goes big on this on its front page. But look at the Mail, UK blitz warning to Iran. It gives the impression that it's going to be much more than some limited strikes.
Well, I think it's, there's very much potential that, again, this could be broadened out. I mean, with any sort of strike of this manner against a group like the Houthis, it's very, very difficult to deter a non-state actor. And that's really what they are. Although they effectively do have a lot of control over Yemen, they are still, essentially a kind of guerrilla terrorist group. So it's then very, very difficult for us and the US to actually deter them seriously because, again, as was mentioned, these drones, they're not very costly. They can continue causing problems. I think they've attacked 27 times since November the 19th. I mean, that is a lot of very small attacks. And for these relatively cheap, irritating attacks, they can cause an immense amount of damage in the global economy. And that is really the reason why America and Britain needs to intervene, because these are attacks on commercial vessels. And if we do not have the capacity to take back control of this region, well, we're going to see things like spiraling inflation, and this is going to be really, really damaging to the global economy. So I can understand why it's tempting to be slightly saber-rattling here. But again, we must have to think, we don't want this to be broadened out into a wider war. It's interesting to see how the Houthis have responded to this. This is not really, it is a direct response to what's going on in Gaza, but this is not in any way, helping the cause of the Palestinians or helping the cause of Hamas. This is really just, creating an irritation for the Western world.
Well, Poppy, it's interesting you say that because your paper does quote Abdul Malik al-Houthi, a senior Houthi official, who says the retaliation to any American strike will not only be at the level of the current operation, which included more than 24 drones and multiple missiles, but will be larger. So not bowed, undaunted. And also, as you said, I mean, you say, well, I mean, you sort of hinted that there wasn't really much point to what they're doing, but they say very clearly these attacks, or your paper says these attacks are aimed at pressuring Israel to halt its bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip.
The difficulty with retaliatory bombings of this nature, we know that the Houthis are able to withstand this sort of bombing. I mean, they've withstood Emirati bombing, they've withstood very heavy Saudi bombing, and about a decade before, they withstood very heavy bombing from Yemen itself, from the previous regime. So we know they are able to kind of withstand this amount of pressure. This is the difficulty. You're kind of in a rock and a hard place. You have to respond. You have to take back this vital shipping area. But also you have the difficulty of, if this is broadened out into a wider war, then the economic problems, the social problems are going to be expanded massively. So I do understand why America feels that they now have to intervene. This is the red line that's been crossed. But again, there is so much scope here for some quite nasty side effects to happen. So it's a very difficult response to get right.
Well, indeed. And to, Owen, I'm just looking at the front page of the Financial Times. Iran raises threat to Mideast shipping lanes with seizure of oil tanker in Gulf. Crude prices rise 2%, challenge to Western powers. And it quotes Tobias Borek at the Royal United Services Institute, who says seizing tankers is a go-to Iranian move to demonstrate their capabilities and to create problems. They do have tankers, or the Houthis still have tankers and their crew hostage. That complicates things further, doesn't it, if there is action of the kind we're describing?
Sure. I mean, when we talk about the costs of this, the extra cost of moving a ship around Africa is around $1 million a ship, and it delays things by a couple of weeks. Against that, these missiles that we're putting in the air cost millions of dollars too. So there is a balance there. I mean, that's where de-escalation lies, I guess. But I can understand that there is a pressure on the Western governments to keep these trade routes open. I mean, interestingly, China is the country that suffers most from this. They're the ones who are putting all the exports through this shipping lane, and they're not getting involved. You also have to think that if you take the ships down Africa, there are piracy problems there, which we're not particularly exercised about. So, there are lots of sort of things going on here. I think we have to remember that Hamas will be very pleased by this. I mean, this is the widening of the war that they wanted. Iran has so far, with its normally pretty sophisticated way of devising policy, managed to get the war widened without getting an attack on themselves, which is exactly what they wanted to do. Now, whether they can sustain that, whether, as you said earlier, Hezbollah are going to get involved, whether this will eventually lead to Iran and there'll be attacks there, we're talking about a much wider war. So it's a first step, but it's a big one.
And when you talk about the Iranian approach, would it be fair to say that they and the Houthis have outfoxed their Western counterparts, because this is what they want? It's not what Britain, US, and others were hoping would happen. Have they been outfoxed?
Well, the Iranians, I'm sure the Iranians think they've so far, but maybe it won't last. But so far, they've achieved their goals, which is to widen it without getting attacked. And they've had Hezbollah doing little bits. They've had things going on in Iraq. They've had things going on in Syria with their proxies doing things there. And, they are tweaking the West. And now they've got a reaction, which is what they want. So, can they contain it? I mean, that's to some extent in the hands of the West. But does the West want to go to war with Iran? Obviously not. And the West has made that pretty clear, which is why the Iranians feel that they can keep on tweaking.
Mm-hmm. And Poppy, how important do you think it is that Britain and the United States are joined by non-Western countries like Bahrain or like the Saudis? Because, of course, if it's Canada, if it's Australia, if it's France, then the people will just say, oh, there you go, it's Western imperialism meddling in the Muslim world again.
Well, I think this is an interesting kind of realignment that you've seen kind of since October 7th, which is which line certain countries are coming down on in terms of their support for who they're backing in this kind of military operation. I'm not necessarily sure I do buy the line that if other Western countries get involved, people will just assume this is an imperialist operation. We have to be very clear about who the aggressors are in this situation. The aggressors are pretty unambiguously the Houthis and their Iranian supporters. So I don't think people are going to see this as some kind of example of a attack that comes from absolutely nowhere, that then the West is having this completely disproportionate response to. As was just mentioned, this is a war that people, do not want to get involved in. We would like this to have as limited military aims as possible. But what we can't accept is to basically just allow the Houthis to just run over the Western world and to create these problems in the commercial sector because of the financial implications it will have on the global economy. So I can see, if this sort of thing continues for a sustained period of time, that yes, I can see the Saudis getting involved. I think they are probably quite fed up of it. And this is not the first run-in that they've actually had with the Houthis. So
Indeed.